Welcome back, Weirdos and Weeaboos, to the channel. I get worse and worse at that every time. Welcome back, Weirdos and Weeaboos, to the channel of the Double Chin Doge, where today, now that I have the whole Shadows of the Spire expansion, I have a lot of new decks that I made, starting with the 100 emoji deck over here. And I'm afraid that only one of these is for Expedition. I kept trying to make things an Expedition, and almost every time I thought, oh, you know what'd be cool, this card. Oh, not Expedition legal. And in the end, as I say, I only made one that was Expedition legal, I'm afraid. Yeah, all these decks use some new cards in some way. Now, to be fair, a lot of these only slot in 1 or 2 new cards. But to be fair, that is probably the best way to make decks with these new cards. We didn't get that many after all, and a lot of them don't synergize with each other. They synergize with cards from separate sets, which means that they kind of belong to separate decks. Now, before we begin, first of all, I just want to say that there are no games in this video. I do plan to make videos of games with these decks in future, that is not going to be this video because there are 8 decks. The video would be ridiculously long if I recorded a game for each deck, and that's even if it was just one game. As well as that, I will give a disclaimer that most of these decks I've only had a few games with, and some of them I haven't even played yet. I mostly just want to show you the idea of how these decks come together, and the whole tweaking process. That's something that I might do a follow-up video on later if any of you actually particularly care about net decking these. I imagine most of you, though, aren't actually looking to copy these decks card for card. You're more just looking for ideas. So these are kind of ideas you could go with. So anyway, I feel like there's more to say, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head, so I guess we'll start. The first deck I made, because it was definitely the easiest deck to make, was the Mono Fire deck. Because really it was pretty obvious what I was going to do there. I was going to put in Jack. I was going to put in Jack's Takedown. This one honestly might be a cut, but I haven't played enough with it to know. Obviously the big thing, World Shaper Staff, works so well in this deck since you have Oni Quartermaster and other weapon synergies. It's basically like another 4 copies of Shogun Scepter, except the weapon is worse but the unit is better. Of course, I'm running Godan. Now, it is arguable whether Godan goes in this deck, because Godan's one of those weird cards. That kind of ability should be so busted, but it's just so often that if the turn you play, you can't warp anything because you spent all your power, and then the turn after your player, she's probably dead, and if she's not, you might still not have a unit on top of your deck, and then the turn after, maybe then you have a unit, but by then she's all dead. If she wasn't dead already, she probably is dead now. We've got Veteran Mercenary. We're actually not running 4 copies of this card, which probably seems a bit strange, because if we're going to get the benefit of this card, then we may as well run as many of them as we can, right? Well, that's usually correct, but I don't think that actually works with this deck. I think you have more than enough draw in this deck with World Shaper Staff and Oni Quartermaster. I don't think you need that much more. In fact, I won't even see you need any more. The only reason that I'm running this is just because even though you don't need any more, of course it's still nice, and this is a well-started unit anyway. Jack Hunted Fugitive, honestly this is a bit of a fun of. It's just a legendary I own but basically never use, but also don't think I want to disenchant. So this just seemed like a good place to put it as top end. Shavka's Loot is also a bit of a fun of. I don't think it's bad in this deck. But I will admit, in the most competitive version of this deck, this probably isn't running it. Mark Maker. Now I'm not sure if people already think this, but I rarely see this card in Constructed, so I'll have it said now that I think this is actually an extremely strong card for Oni strategies. Because, of course, it is an Oni itself, which works well with Jishu, and it plays a weapon, which works well with Oni Quartermaster, and obviously these 2 Onis right here are the backbone of aggro Oni decks. Goes in Dark Heart, even though we have no Dragon Synergy in here, really, unless... Do we have a thing in the market? Oh, we do have a Draconic Ire, and I don't think we have any other dragons in here. We actually aren't running Eclipse Dragon. I think I considered that, but in the end there just wasn't enough room for it. But yeah, Cozen Darkheart, basically, if it gets an attack buff from this, then it pops off. Blaken Apprentice, I hate this card, but I have to admit it's pretty good. It just kind of snowballs, and your opponent can't do anything about it unless they have spell damage, which, if they're using spell damage on this, then they're not using spell damage on your Oni Quartermaster that you'll drop later, and stuff like that. Flame Blast obviously just gives us reach to kill. Blazing Salvo is an amazing card and obviously lets us run a bit of a market so that we can run Factory Quota to stop them from gaining health and deal damage to them if they're a deck with not many units. Again, look at you, Skycrag spell damage. Of course, we've got Edict of Shavka in case we're against a Horu deck or something. So yeah, it's a bit weird to have this in the market, but I couldn't fit it in the main deck, and I think the damage is nice. And obviously it can also board control. Slag. I think this is a very underrated card. To be fair, it is very hard to fit it into a deck, but I think this is actually a pretty sweet card, because while it's super situational that your opponent has a Sentinel for you to kill, Sentinels are one of the big things that stop this deck. Like, mid-range counters aggro, and most of the best Sentinels are kind of, you know, stuff like Sandstorm Titan. This destroys, obviously, Sandstorm Titans. Now, I think the reason why this card doesn't isn't played as much as it probably should be is just because, although that sounds great, it's basically like an Annihilate in that case, and Annihilate, obviously, can kill anything as long as it's single faction, which is a lot more common than it being a Sentinel. But, of course, Annihilate is in Shadow, which is the faction that actually specialises in killing things. So, in a deck where we're running just Fire, which doesn't specialise in killing things, it can be nice to have something that can actually kill the big meaty unit. And as well as that, killing relics, of course, is an important thing to have somewhere in your deck. Especially because the Draconic Ire, although it seems a bit redundant to run both of these, you've got to remember the Draconic Ire is almost never coming out. The only reason we have this in the market is because we don't need that many market slots. The only other thing that could go in this market is maybe a combat trick that gives Overwhelm, but we are running banners, which means that we get Shugo Tactics at a certain point anyway, so although it's not as convenient as have it in the market, we kind of don't need that. It might turn out that we do, but I'm thinking we don't. And I haven't needed it so much from anything like that from the market in my game so far. But anyway, so that means Draconic Ire is in here, even though I think literally the only thing that activates it is the Dragunov Kozin. Just because it is a very nice bonus if you get that off. Yeah, I think there might have been more dragons in the deck earlier, but obviously they got cut. So yeah, and that's why we need Slag and Draconic Ire, because Draconic Ire is actually very rarely going to come out. But when it does come out, it should be quite strong. Akko, I'm only running one of these because I only own one of these. I don't think they're actually very necessary. This is one of those cards where, as sick as it looks, it's not bad. It's definitely not wrong to run it, but also you do not need it at all. Like, this deck works perfectly fine without Akko. It's just kind of nice to have. I mean, you could definitely run a few more Kazuos or Oni Ronins. Oh yeah, speaking of Kazuo, you might find it weird that we have Kazuo in this deck when this is literally the only relic weapon in the deck. But I think thinking that Kazuo is a relic weapon synergy card is very understandable, but still I would call a mistake. Because honestly, giving this +1 attack and overwhelm is not a big deal. The only time it's a big deal is if you have weapon synergy, because obviously that buff is a weapon, but that's pretty situational to have both the relic weapon and a weapon synergy card on the board at once, and then you only get one trigger, so it's not like you get a massive payoff for it. The reason you want to run this card is just because it's an amazing top deck compared to most 1-drops. The thing with 1-drops is playing a 1-drop on 1 is really strong. Playing a 1-drop any other time is usually pretty weak. And that makes them kind of awkward. And it means that the best 1-drops in these kind of games is almost always one that if you draw it in the late game isn't a dead card. And this is not a dead card if you draw it in the late game. If you have like 7 power or something, you can spend 5 of that 7 power on invoking. I'm not saying 7 power because for any specific reason, I'm just saying, I don't know, that's just kind of an amount that came to my head for the late game. And at that point you are using a decent amount of your power. And obviously the Invoke gives you a chance to find a card that can win you the game from that position of being out of cards. So yeah, this is quite a good draw. Long barrel, we're running this because, well, we have a lot of fire influence, so we can. I think the reason this card doesn't get run more is mostly because it's not worth the heavy fire influence cost in most of the time, but, you know, we're already in mono fire, we may as well run it. I do think that this is a generally decent card, aside from that. Giving a unit +2 attack and overwhelm seems fair, and piercing shot, obviously that damage can be very, very useful sometimes in clearing the board. Now I will say one change I would make to this deck, in fact I might even make it now, I won't do it on camera right now, is that initially I did not expect Jek to be that good, because I was starting to think when I made this deck that Jek probably didn't get his abilities doubled damage. Like, oh, sorry, that came out really bad. So, when he discards a sigil, he gets double damage, but as I was mentioning in the last video when I was talking about these cards, whether this card is good or not hinged a lot on whether the deal 2 damage to 2 enemies ability, whether that's considered coming from you, the player, or from Jek, the unit. Because if it comes from him, giving him double damage is a massive deal because it means you do 4 damage to 2 enemies. And it also means that if you hit face with that ability that you get a treasure trove instantly for free. Now, it turns out that is how it works. If you give Jek double damage, it will double the damage of that ability, which is amazing. I think this card is a 4 of in this deck because of that. But I didn't think it would work that way, which is why I initially only put 2 of them in there. So yeah, I would say that the real version of this deck would run 4 of these. Honestly, I might even kick the Jek's takedown to run 4 of these Jet Mercenary Hunters. Like, it's nice for reach, but it doesn't give you any kind of tempo. So it's a bit of a weird one. Anyway, that's the first deck. Honestly, I talked about that deck for longer than I intended to, so I'll try and speed things up a little bit as we move on. These next 2 decks are a Throne and an Expedition version of the same kind of deck. So this is Blech. I call it Blech because I really don't like this strategy, but at the same time, I wanted to do it because I was sick of losing to it. So yeah. Basically, you may notice that I mentioned in the last video I've been saving up Shiftstone, and now it's all gone. Well, those are the things that I was crafting, but the big thing is this guy. So, for the longest time, I definitely thought this is a good card, but I thought it might have been a little bit overrated, but then I was realising, wow, that's a corrupted 1. You pay 1 and you get an 8/8, and all you need to have done is get a decent amount of units dead. I think this card is actually really kind of a problem. I think I'm hoping it will be nerfed in future. So yeah, this is an even deck. Yeah, you're probably having a moment of like, wait, what's going on here? Because you can see all the 3 cost and 1 cost cards I have. Well, I said in the last video I thought this would be too hard to do, but turns out it's actually not that hard, and it's especially worth it. It's a Spire Shadows even deck. So, in this deck, I think I'm running, is it 8 merchants? I'm running 4 Edmund Dune Smugglers and 4 Aurelian Merchants. Which, yeah, so we've got 8 merchants, which means that we are very likely to pull Spire Shadows early. And then once we play Spire Shadows, we have an even deck, so our even-handed golems are activated. Which means we get loads of draw, and then besides that, this is just a general kind of destruction sacrifice deck. That just runs units that get benefits from the swap. I think Carver is unusual in this kind of list, but it's just, you know, even though it's just 2 less in cost and 2 more attack, on a flying and lifesteal unit, that's a pretty big deal. Also, obviously, he summons cultists. Also, this deck already has a bit of synergy with cultists. So yeah, Disassociate. I really usually don't like this card, but in this deck I think it makes sense. I was just really thinking, in a deck like this, there's almost no point in fighting for the board, as the opponent, I mean, because Kato just always wins. You need to use spells to beat your opponent out, so it makes sense that I'm thinking a step ahead there and thinking, well, if he's going to run spells, I should run negates. At the same time, there are no good negates in Destruction Colours, except for Corrupt, but Corrupt will only hit targeted things that are hitting my units or me, and there are a decent amount of spells that I'd be worried about that Corrupt wouldn't deal with. Mostly I'm thinking of Harsh Rule and stuff like that. So this can negate anything, although it goes back into their hand. They have to pay 3 more to play it again, but honestly, they usually just play it again, because if it was worth negating, it was probably a pretty game-winning spell, so really this just gives you an extra turn to try and win, usually. So that's why I usually don't like this card, but in this deck, as I say, it deals with its weaknesses. Now, you might also be noticing the 3 journey guides, but aside from me realising that there really weren't a lot of good options for 1-cost units that would become even cost when Spire Shadows was played, this is also in the deck because of a little combo that I've been using more often recently, and that is... I just realised it's not here. Oh, I guess I cut it. Yeah, I guess it's just good enough in its own anyway, because it does become a 0-1-3 after Spire Shadows. But yeah, I was about to say Nahid's Distillation, but I suppose... Oh yeah, I cut Nahid's Distillation because of the fact this is an even deck and we're also running 4 Devours, so we're drawing enough cards. So yeah, actually that makes sense. So this with Even-Hand Golem instead then. But this is really good with Nahid's Distillation as well, because of course exhausting this unit doesn't matter at all since it can't attack in the first place. And then it's a 4-cost, draw 3 cards and reduce their costs by 1, which is obviously pretty crazy if you obviously get that combo. So yeah, it's a bit weird to be running one-offs like this for me, but I did want to have both of these cards, but also didn't think this deck needed that many kill spells, since usually we'd be ahead on board, and also we do have Two-Face for if we need to be defensive. Aurelian Supplier is just in this deck because it's another good target for Spire Shadows. It's not amazing, but it's still good. And it's we have a lot of units on the board, so you will always get at least 1 card from this, basically. It will be a lot more rare you get the second card just because of how many cards you draw when you're playing this deck, but yeah. Eager Offering, it's kind of weird that I'm running Eager Offering and not running Nahid's Distillation, because as good as a card as this is, Nahid's Distillation almost always just blows it out of the water. But the reason why here it's actually not as good is because of Spire Shadows, because this becomes a 0-3-4. How did that... What the... I did not want that to happen. Okay, this becomes a 0-3-4 if you play Spire Shadows, which obviously the stat line doesn't really matter that much, except for the 1 turn it's alive where it can block, but still, 0 cost draw 3 cards is good, even if it's delayed. So, yeah. Rectifier, man, I hate this card. I hate that it exists, and I think it's inherently bad for the game that it's in here, but I couldn't deny any longer that it's really good in this deck, especially because we're running Arc of Saw in the market, of course. And especially because it's just a nice, small, corrupted unit that deals with the opponent's stuff. Because, as I mentioned, the spells and abilities are the main things that are going to beat this deck out. Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about one of the weirdest cards in this deck, Xenon Cupbearer. This is usually a terrible card, but it's just another card that's amazing when you play Spire Shadows on it. Like... Again, just like Carver, 2 less cost and 2 more attack doesn't seem like a big deal, but a 2-4-4 lifesteal, even the late game, is really good because it's just a nice combination of stats where you can just throw it out there if you're in a position where you're likely to die, and because it's so cheap at 2, that's kind of a nice cost where it's very common that you'll be able to play that in combinations with other cards in the late game. So it means that you can still push yourself closer to winning the game, even when you're in a situation where you're likely to die, because you can play this out. And of course, giving lifesteal units extra attack is bigger than giving normal units extra attack. It means that this really keeps you alive for longer. There was a stranger deck I ran into when I was playing this deck that was very close to getting a quick kill on me, and then this came down as a 2-4-4 lifesteal, and it single-handedly won me the game. I took him to a ridiculous, like, 20-turn game, and yeah, eventually I just got a ridiculous amount of value and won out. So, yeah. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention just one more thing I just wanted to say. So, when I said that I thought that Spire Shadows with even-handed golems would be too difficult to pull off, I made a mistake when I said that, obviously. The big reason I didn't predict this is because I didn't realise until after I made that video, hang on a minute, most merchants have an even amount of attack. I didn't think of that before, and as soon as I realised that, I'm like, actually, this could work. Because obviously, my main thinking was, well, if you gotta run Spire Shadows in the main deck because you can't run merchants, and you gotta run 4 of them to make sure that you get them, and because your even-handed golems aren't activated until you get them, you can't even really use your extra draw to get there in time. So it seems like you'd have to run a lot of a card that's dead if you get more than one of them, and on top of that, you would not be able to rely on drawing it every game. It would only get drawn half the time. That's why I was really like, yeah, this is just going to be a dead card. It's not going to work this way. But then, of course, I saw, oh, I can have 0 cost 3/3 Aurelian merchants. Yeah, that definitely changes things. So yeah, I don't think there's anything else to talk about in this deck. Let me just be a bit more thorough. And his choice is just so we can get Cultists to hit face and get Arc of Soul for when we're dead on power. And obviously it puts more units to sacrifice on the board. The second option's alright. It also fills a void. Yeah, that's about it. Vara's favour is just to stay alive and draw more power. Yes, I think I was also running Seer at one point, but I think it got cut for Dissociate. So the next deck is basically this, but for Expedition, and of course it's not even, because even-handed golem is not in Expedition, thank goodness. This one is a lot more vanilla. In fact, are there any new cards? Oh yeah, I'm still running Spire Shadows. Feels weird to not have it in the market, but as you can see, this is a 5-cost market. Now, technically I could run Blazing Salvo instead of Crack the Earth, and then I could run this in the market in Expedition. But honestly, I don't think it's worth it. To be honest, Spire Shadows is a bit here as a fun card. It's still very solid in this deck, but it might not actually be the strongest card for this deck. This version of the deck doesn't benefit as much. You still got Xenon Cupbearer, so that's still a good combo. Gentle Grazer is also pretty decent with it. One of the stronger ones is Kozin Darkheart with this, because it makes it have 3 attack and cost 1, which means that as soon as this lands 1 hit, you instantly get the dragon. Was there any others that were particularly good with this? Nah, I think that was basically it. So yeah, there's some good hits, but it's not as crazy. As you can see, we're running 4 Nahid's Distillation and 4 Devours, so we still have a lot of draw, even though we don't have even-handed golems, so it's not as efficient. We of course are still running Arc of Soul to help us with being dead on power. This market, I think it needs to be a 5-cost market, because I was kind of surprised. Dover the Fearmonger was a card that I really thought you could just main deck, but in my experience, even though I only have 1 copy of them to be fair, but even in the times that I've drawn them from the main deck, a lot of the time it's been inconvenient, because obviously there's the usual issue of, oh, maybe I don't have enough influence, but I also found it surprisingly difficult to play this, not have it die, and then sacrifice a unit. Because that seemed like it'd be easy because of how cheap it can be in most situations, but most good ways to sacrifice units do cost you something. Except, I'd say, Kindling Carver. I think every other method of sacrificing units costs you something that's actually any good. And that means that even if you're using a 1-cost sacrifice like Combust, you're paying 6 for this to get anything from its ability, which that is quite concerning, because 6 again is that thing that I was saying last video about this is the point where you need to be winning the game. So yeah. Although the mastery on this card, I will say, is quite good, even though it's relatively rare to hit it. If you do hit it, it's usually a game winner, even if it is a slow burn. Because one thing that's great about the Skeletal Dragons is that they kind of, when if you ever give one an attack buff and then it dies, then it obviously will become the new highest attack unit in your void, and every single one after that will keep getting stronger. And I actually won that game when I was talking about grinding against strangers. It was an expedition, not throne. I got the decks mixed up because I know it was this because I had Dover on the board and Makar's Quiver. Makar's Quiver, you'll give each of these +1 attack whenever you summon one. So basically, every time one of them died, then every next Skeletal Dragon had an extra attack. So that was a very nice combo. Oh yeah, speaking of Makar's Quiver, it's mostly just in here because aside from the 1/1 cultists, most of these units are single faction. It's a generally powerful thing. It can also be used as removal. It is a bit of a fun of though. Again, I only own one of these, which is why we're only running one. I think you would probably only run two if you were using this properly though. So, you know, it's not too different from, you know, the way that I think is the most competitive way to do it. Oh yeah, I think I never actually got around to saying this. Spire Shadows, this is not a 4 of, because this is a dead card once you play the first one. And as I said, this deck benefits from Spire Shadows, but it's not as important in this deck. So it's not like this deck does not work if you don't draw Spire Shadows. So yeah. It also feels weird not running 4 Kindling Carvers, but I did find that this deck struggled to have enough units on the board, and it also struggled to have enough power, which meant that I thought I should run more Destruction Chant and cut one of these, and I cut one of something else as well, but I forgot what it was. I think it was the 4 Spire Shadows, because I think I was running 4 at one point. So yeah. Oh yeah, also in the market was Makar Stranger and Grodar's Burden. Obviously just because giving them Exalted when you're sacrificing them is pretty good. I think that was basically it for interesting things in the market though. That's also it for the decks that I have actually play tested, I will admit. Now we're getting into a bit more dangerous territory, but most of these decks are decks that I feel pretty confident will at least be decent no matter what, which is why I haven't gotten around to play testing them yet. I know I could play test them just before I played this video, but I'm not gonna lie, I've played so many games already today from, you know, getting enough money for the set today, that yeah, I really can't be bothered to play any more games today, but I can be bothered to deck build and ramble about it. So yeah, this is essentially my recreation of the Argenport mono, well, not actual mono, but mostly mono Justice deck that I was talking about before, but now with the new cards. So I think this deck could be a very serious deck. I obviously, as I say, I haven't test played it yet, so I definitely think it's realistic that there could be tweaks that need to be made to this to make it a serious deck. But I think that overall this should be pretty solid. One of the only things that is a little bit weird, but I think is correct, is that I am not running many 1-drops. We're running 3 Seat Power and 4 Silverblade Intrusion. And you can't play Silverblade Intrusion on 1, so it's not even really a 1-drop. So yeah, that is a bit rough. In the original deck, I ran Tinker Apprentices, I think is the name of the card. The 1/1 that gives a card in your hand +1/+1, which may seem to you like a very strange choice, because that's kind of a typical, oh, you're a beginner if you're using this card. But honestly, in this deck it was quite good, because you could give Ikaria +1/+1 so she didn't die to little 1 damage pings, and you could give your relic weapons +1/+1, and if you give +1/+1 to a relic weapon, it's actually a big deal. Also, Bartholo is a pretty good target as well. And Hidden Road Smuggler for that matter, because sometimes you just need that lifesteal, sometimes you needed a good blocker. So yeah, I wanted to run it in this deck, but I just didn't find the slots for it. It's honestly, like, I think as soon as I cut a card from this deck, I think it goes back in. It might even turn out that I don't want to run 4 Silverblade Intrusions. Honestly, I'm kind of only running 4 of them because I want to see how well they do. I don't actually expect I'll keep 4 of them in the deck. Because although I do think this is a very strong card, I think that the first ability is not something you want 4 copies of unless you're getting the 5 influence thing. And you won't always be able to count on the 5 influence thing. It should be pretty consistent though, considering how good this deck is at getting Justice. Damara is being run out as a one-of. I think this card is still pretty good. It was predicted to be pretty good in the end. I don't think many people have been playing it. I'm still playing it. It definitely underwhelmed me, but I think overall it is still a very solid card. I would probably run 2 of these, but as I say, I only own 1 right now. Icaria is an easy 4-of. We have a decent amount of Valkyries in this deck. We need Justice Influence. We need more rewards for having loads of Justice Influence. We need Ramp. She basically just does everything we need. The only problem with her is the fact that she's a 1-1, of course. Lost Scroll is our second way of ramping and also fixing Justice Influence. Bartholo the Seducer. This is one of the more removable cards in this deck, but I think it is right to run him because sometimes he just gets you that last bit of damage you need to win the game. He's really annoying to deal with, so it makes it so that you almost always have, at least once you play him, he sticks around, which is good because we are running Regent's Tomb in the market, a card that very much needs to be protected, even if it is just by tiny blockers, because it's very important you finish its agenda. So even though you don't usually want to be blocking with this, it's worth it to protect a Regent's Tomb a lot of the time. And of course, you can pay 7 and draw a relic weapon from the deck. I don't think we're running any normal relics. I think, oh, that is one thought. The original deck, I think, ran 1 Avergraft, just so that Bartholo could pull it, even though it's not as good as Slay or Cast into Shadow. And I don't think this deck is running 1. No, it's not. So that's another thing. There's just so many things that could go in this deck, but you have to try and make it optimized, so you can't put everything in. Lada, Svetya's Advisor, I said this is the best card in the set, and I still stand by that. The only reason we're not running 4 of these is because, well, the only sites we're running are the 3 Dizos office and the Regent's Tomb. Those are the only sites we can run, and obviously one of those is already in the market, so it's like, it's going to be relatively common, I think, that you play this and you don't get a site down. But I think that the times that you do get a site down are going to be so strong that it's worth sacrificing those obviously for those times when you don't have a site and this is just a 3-2-4. So yeah, Slay and Cast into Shadow, obviously both of these are just extremely efficient kill spells, especially Cast into Shadow, although of course Cast into Shadow can only work on single faction units. The trick to play in this kind of deck well is you really have to think, is this worth my card whenever you play something? Because here's the thing with Argenport. Argenport's just straight up overpowered, but it's quote-unquote balanced because they don't have much draw that's any good, like, at all, which means that they get dead hands. Like, they have amazing pop-offs and then they just get dead hands, which is why I think we haven't seen that much Argenport control most of the time. But I do think Argenport control is a very serious deck. You just can't play cards just because you can play them. You can't play kind of the normal way of playing. Usually, if you see a good opportunity to use a card, you play it straight away before you lose that opportunity. And honestly, that isn't a bad way of thinking a lot of the time, as long as you keep in mind that that's not the right solution for every situation. Usually that is actually the correct way of playing these games. But I think with an Argenport deck, you have to get into a different mindset of every card I have is precious. And every card I have can also be extremely powerful if I use it correctly. So I really have to be patient and just wait for the perfect moment to get these to work, like, really well. So I think you should basically always be decimating Cast into Shadow, unless, 1, the single target you're hitting is a massive target, or 2, you are in a situation where it's highly likely you will just die if you don't play this, for 1. Because if you get 2 kills on this, that will often give you a lot of extra stall time. That means you can live to the late game. Now, you see, this thing I just said about card advantage, this is another kind of principle of the deck. This is the reason why we're running so much, well, I say so much, we're only running 2 walk cards, but we're running both Saditi and End of the Line. You see, this doesn't have to be a Mono Justice deck. I only made this a Mono Justice deck because this deck needs Saditi. And that can seem a bit weird to say, considering that Curse of Provocation got heavily nerfed. Obviously, this is still a very good card, but Curse of Provocation, it's a lot more rare that it actually draws you cards now. It's not important that Curse of Provocation draws you cards, although that's nice. what's more important is this is a massive unit that demands an answer that has warp. So if you have a dead hand, which is very often how you actually end up losing with this deck, if you do lose, there's a chance every turn. There's a chance that Siditi will appear on the top of your deck, and one warp of Siditi, even if you don't onslaught him, can sometimes be the difference between losing a game and winning a game. Even in against very control heavy decks, sometimes that's exactly what you need. Because there's just like that one free draw. Because each card you have in this deck is just more powerful than most decks' other cards. Just getting that one extra card is massive. That's also where we're running End of the Line, even though this is usually a bit of a card that's too slow and a bit under the power curve. I would be running 2 of these, but I only own 1, so yeah. It's maybe even possible that you should run 3 of these, but that does seem a bit too slow, and I do think too often then you would be drawing them earlier than you wanted. Stormhold Knife is also another classic way that we don't dare to aggro. Of course, as soon as our health gets low, we bust out a massive relic weapon and punish them, and obviously the armor is like giving us extra health. Oh yeah, and another quick thing I wanted to mention is that Deezer's Office, the reason why we're running 3 of these, because I originally only run 2 of these, because they are expensive, they're very dead draws early on, and they're only very good when you top deck in the late game. The only reason we're running 3 here now, instead of less than that, is because of Lada. It does mean that she's bricked less often, and she does make Deezer's Office a bit of a faster card. Savior of the Meek, this is probably a cut. Honestly, I am. Okay, my argument for keeping this is just, again, it helps you against aggro. It summons a little 1/1. And obviously, every card you need to get as much value as you can out of it. And if you can play this card, if it does go that late, which with all the ramps, sometimes you will just have way more power than you need, then this can, be a lot of value and it can save you. But now I'm looking at it, I'm like, there's a good chance I should just cut this, considering how much I've been talking about other cards that could easily fit into this deck and they would be pretty strong. Anyway, I think I got a bit sidetracked, but there's a lot of things to talk about with this deck. Inquisitor Macto, we're running this just because, well, obviously it's a solid unit, but when I was talking about how we don't have good draw, and basically we have to get as much value as possible out of every card, Warp is one way of doing this kind of pseudo getting extra cards. The other way is of course Revenge. We would be running more Revenge units, but honestly, a lot of them don't work very well with this deck. Stone Powder Alchemist is a bit slow, and although this is probably more a control deck than a tempo deck, this is a deck where you can sometimes win very early by getting Siditi down, and I think that needs to be part of the deck, so you can't afford to run Stone Powder Alchemist, I think. And then aside from that, a lot of the Revenge cards are pretty slow and just weak. Unless you run loads of Revenge Synergy, and this deck doesn't want to do that, I don't think. So, Inquisitor Macto is really the only Revenge card that I think fits in, but it also makes sense since he's a Valkyrie, so it's fine. So yeah, and the other thing I think I mentioned is the Silverblade Menace, the new card. So this one could be a cut, but it is a Valkyrie, which means it gets buffed by Ikaria. Not a massive deal, but a 4/4 flyer is a little bit scary. And of course this gives you sustain to stay alive, which could be important again against aggro decks. It could just turn out this deck has too much countering for aggro decks and not enough ways to deal with other decks. And if that happens, this is probably a cut, as well as Savior of the Meek. But if that isn't the case, then yeah, this should be a very solid card that is kind of fills a similar role to Valkyrie Enforcer. Because with this deck, once you get to 5 power, you're basically in the clear. You very rarely lose from that point if you have 5 power and you have the influence you need. Unless you end up taking a long time to get to that point. But that means that one of the most common ways that you lose with this deck is that you get stuck on 4 or 3 power. There's enough insurance in this deck that you rarely get stuck on 2, but getting stuck on 4 or 3... that really hurts because all your power plays are at the next kind of power. So these cards are just kind of insurance, even though we don't run many of them because they do drag the deck down if we run too many. They're kind of a little bit of insurance to say, okay, this will keep you alive and let you stall until you can get to that point. So yeah. And I just called this very serious because this is probably the most competitive deck here, and also just I feel like all these people are very serious. This one is a similar kind of idea of deck. I advise you to win better. This is probably a deck that I would say is quote-unquote built around Larder, but which is why it's called, you know, I advise you to win better. But honestly, we're only running one site. I think it was only one because the only other one I could run. Yeah, I'm only running one. And that site is Korovyet Palace. But Korovyet Palace is an amazing site, and we're running 4 copies of it. Usually I would not run 4 of these. I would usually only run 2 or 3, despite how good it is. But this deck, you know, we got Larder. We want to hit the site. Larder with Korovyet Palace, I think, might just be win the game on the spot. This is kind of a Justice Control deck, but it almost kind of isn't, because honestly, you should be topping out at about turn 6. So it's almost more like a mid-range deck, especially because we're running 4 Vorlunk Core. There's not much reason this is really here. It just seems solid to me. You just control the board, and you get a scary attacker that your opponent has to use spells on to kill. Just seems good. And if hostilities, again, I just own one. And I do think it's a good idea to put in this deck. It gives you a little bit extra value. It works well with the permanent buff from Withstand off of Korovyet Palace. And copying Larder seems kind of terrifying. Obviously, copying merchants could also be used to search for things. On the lower end, we have Ghostblade Outcast, which I don't usually run in Korovyet Palace decks, but obviously with the Exalted, it's another thing where giving it that buff is a good idea. And also it just has lifesteal, so it keeps you alive. I mainly put this in because I realised I had the issue of not actually having enough units in this deck, considering that I did need Korovyet Palace to, you know, hit units. You might notice we have a surprising amount of negates. We have Swift Refusal, Unseal, and Numbing Cold, 1 of each. Well, I'll talk about each of these individually. I think that 2 or 3 negates is a good amount to run in a deck. So we're running 3 here. But we're running 1 of all these different ones because, well, Unseal is the normal kind of negate that is very kind of just all-purpose, because of course it can also hit curses. But we're running Swift Refusal because this is actually a very nice card to pull out. When I first saw Swift Refusal and Savage Denial, the one that negates the spell that is fast, I thought that these were terrible, because of course it's way more situational than Negate, which is already a situational ability, and it only costs 1 less, and I thought that's not worth it. But it actually is, not because it costs 1 less, but because you only need 1 power save to be able to play it, which might sound like a bit of an oxymoron or something like that, but it is very important that, because very often if you've only saved 1 power and then you pass, your opponent is way less likely to think you have a fast spell at the ready. And because these kind of cards are rarely run, they also rarely expect that you're going to negate something. They basically the only thing they might think is that maybe you have a Defiance, which we are running 4 of in this deck so we don't die to aggro, or maybe you have a Finest Hour. Those are probably the only 2 things in their head they're going to even consider that you have. And to deal with those, they're very likely to play a spell, and then obviously they've just fallen right into your trap and you can pull this. Now you may say, oh, so you negate spells more often. Cool, I guess. Still doesn't seem worth it for the, you know, extra, like, you know, unflexibility. There's a better word for it and I can't think of it right now, it's left my head. But, thingy, but it's not just that. Because they don't think you're going to pull a negate, if they did think they were going to you were going to pull a negate, they would probably play a cheap spell. If they don't think they're going to pull a negate, they're very much more likely to pull a big spell. So this is very good at hitting some strong spells. You can use this to negate Honor of Claws and stuff, Harsh Rules, and Nahid's Distillations. So yeah, this just very commonly gets a lot of value if you do hit it. And it is of course a little difficult to hit it, but that's why we're only running it as a one-off. Numbing Cold is being run because sometimes it's a lot more easy and just efficient to play the negate in advance. Even if it does mean that you don't get the surprise value, it does make it a lot easier. And we're also running it because we're running 3 Perul's Choice. We're running Perul's Choice because Permafrost is a very good card, so we're running one of those so Perul's Choice can pull it. And Avergraft as well, so we can get a kill on the fly. And also, giving a unit +1/+1 on Aegis at fast speed is actually really strong. Like, honestly, the second option is kind of the better option a lot of the time. It seems like a card where drawing a curse is the main option and giving a unit Aegis is the backup option, but it's kind of the other way around. Giving a unit +1/+1 on Aegis can be used as another way to negate spells, because obviously this is fast, so they play it on one of your units, and then you just give them Aegis and you negate their spell. And obviously you give them +1/+1 as a bonus. This also works really well with Ghostblade Outcast. So yeah, Perul's Choice is very strong in any deck as long as it can have minions on the board, which isn't that hard to do. Crown Watch Paladin, this is usually a more aggressive card, but it works here. It gives us value with the Warcry. It has Aegis, so it doesn't die to spells. It sticks around. It's very good to buff with Corviet Palace. Vanquish's Blade. I would run Vanquish, but we already have way too many 3-drops in this deck, and this also does give a lot more value. And it is just a strong card in general. Considering I think we have just about enough units that it's fair to run this. Yeah, it goes in. Now we're running the Primal Merchant here. I think that it's way better to have a reliable unit with Aegis than to have a unit that sometimes gives you and itself Aegis. I don't think you can rely as much on the Rime Conclave Smuggler to have Aegis, and as well as that, I think a 2-3 stat line is honestly better than a 3-2 stat line with Aegis for a market card, because usually you want them to block until you can play what you got from your market. For Wisdom of the Elders, obviously just very efficient card draw. For Harsh Rule, just very efficient board control. Wrath of Caiaphas. Okay, so this is the elephant in the room I wasn't really addressing at first. Honestly, this is a bit of a kind of experiment. I don't actually think this is right in this deck, but I want to try it. It might be. Because again, I was saying that the way that this card actually ends up being good is it turns out being able to pay 2 to swap it for a power card is actually really powerful. Just because of the flexibility it provides, and this does seem like one of the kind of decks where it would help. Now, the reason I'm a little bit unsure about it is because this deck does draw a decent amount, which means that discarding your hand and drawing 7 cards is not a very powerful effect. However, it does have another point of synergy, which is in the market, and this is another weird choice, but I actually think it's correct. Savage Incursion. Yeah, I don't think you expected this, but here it is. Wrath of Caiaphas helps put cards in the void for Savage Incursion, obviously by forcing your opponent to discard them. And Savage Incursion on its own, even if you don't have Wrath of Caiaphas, I think might actually be right in this deck, because I think that basically this is supposed to be the super late game market card that wins you the game if it's gone on for ages. And usually those are very expensive cards, like Martyr's Chains, but I couldn't run Martyr's Chains without running Rime Conclave Smuggler, and I already told you I don't really want to do that. And in terms of win conditions in Primal that I could run in the market, I had Quicksilver Mirror, but to be honest, I don't think I had enough good targets in this deck to copy with Quicksilver Mirror. This is literally the biggest unit in my deck. So, and also, Quicksilver Mirror is a much slower win condition, even if it costs a little bit less than other massive win conditions. I could have run the 10-8-8 that stops any spells from being played, but that also is really, really slow, and I think, although this is a controlling kind of deck, as I say, it's almost not a control deck, it's almost more mid-range, so I think that it'll be hard for it to get to 10 power. And then even if it does, it's not going to win the game all the time because, you know, sometimes maybe my opponent doesn't need spells and sometimes maybe an 8-8 just isn't enough and I can't kill him with an 8-8. Like, if I'm against a KO deck, they summon 8-8s all the time, you know, I'm not going to be able to attack in with that, so I'm not going to be able to win the game with it. It's just going to stall and then I'll die because that's the biggest thing in my deck, so I'm not stalling to get anything to win the game. So anyway, I kept looking and I basically found that the only thing in my collection that was a primal card that really would have been a big finisher that would actually work for this deck is Savage Incursion. And then I thought that actually, yeah, that actually does make a lot of sense, because it's going to be very hard to get to a game where you have 20 cards in your opponent's void, because you're not discarding anything except with Wrath of Caiaphas. But 10 is not going to be that hard, and a 5-cost deal 3 damage and draw 3 cards is fine enough. That's really good still. And of course, sometimes it will give you the 20, and then it should just be a win the game on the spot, unless they have harsh rule. And if they do have harsh rule, you've got your negates at the ready. So yeah, I think this is actually very correct to run here, even though it seems very strange. Also, Bottled Storm, I usually like to run this. This is a card that I almost always try to run in primal decks, but almost always gets cut just right at the end. And I've considered running it in the market quite a few times, but this is the first time I've actually ever put it in the market. This is mostly just because I wanted to have more draw besides just Wisdom of the Elders in case I didn't draw it. But I didn't want to run Honor of Claws because I felt like, since as I said, this is a more mid-rangey deck, by turn 4, you should really be setting up your board for your finishers at turn 6. And if you're just drawing cards on that turn, it just seemed wrong to me. Even though we do have a big dip in the 4-drop slot. So I didn't want to run Honor of Claws in the main deck. And so obviously that meant I needed to put more card drawing here. But then I thought, well, if I put Honor Claws on here, it's only going to be good at certain times, you know. What if I could put something that actually gets me more cards? And Bottled Storm is kind of an alternative to Savage Incursion. It's not as good, but if Savage Incursion isn't activated, and I don't know, maybe my opponent's played Gyarados Stranger and keeps shuffling his Void back into his deck, so it's never going to really get a big activation, you can go for Bottled Storm. You pay 12 power, you deal 3 damage, and you draw 3 cards. It's basically like a Savage Incursion for 10. Only you have to pay way more, but over multiple turns. So yeah, and Vigilance of Austerity is of course just in here because it deals with relics. It's the only way we can really do that. And Hailstorm is just in here because it clears the board. So that's that deck. Now, Seeds of the Revolution. Hoo boy, this is a this one turned out weird. So this is the Edge of Uprising deck. I was running 4 of these. It might still be right to run 4 of them, but I did actually cut it down to 3. And I think you're still very likely to draw this, even with just 3. So I think that's fine. So this deck, it came out weird. So I did say already that one way you could use this is by using discard synergy. And so I did that. We have a Menace deck here with Felrout the Outcast. And it was going to be a discard synergy deck. But honestly, when I said that, although Felrout was the only one I could think of on the spot, and the other 2, I thought there was more cards than just Felrout, the Faceless one, and the Primal spell that when you discard it, you stun a unit. I thought there was more than that, but there isn't. Those are actually the only things that get benefits when they're discarded, except for Privilege of Rank, but that's Injustice. All the other benefits you get is just for putting things in your Void and then playing them out. I didn't think there was enough room in this deck to make it one of those kind of decks. You didn't really want big units in this deck because you want small units to discount Edge of Uprising. But then if you don't have big units, then what are you getting? Why are you putting things in your Void to pull them back? Because the whole point is to like pull back something giant. So yeah, it got a bit awkward, and I thought, right. So I think the best way to go about this is just to make Felrout the Outcast have his have him be more important in the deck, and the easiest way to do that was obviously to run 4 of him, because I wasn't actually thinking of running 4 at first. And also make it actually a mill deck. So this isn't a full-on mill deck, but it is a mill deck. We're running 2 Strange Brokers, which actually fits well in this deck. It is a slower deck, and although they don't have 1 attack, sadly, they are a nice, good blocker that in the late game can constantly play Permafrost on units, and obviously helps us mill. We're not running that many Strangers, but there is a Feln Stranger in the market, which can be pulled out by Blazing Salvo, which helps us fix her influence for Felrauq, and also can trigger Strange Broker. But this isn't an expedition deck, so we also have Howling Peak Smuggler, just that extra consistency. As you can see, we have Devourer in here just because we have so many small units with 4 assembly lines, 3 Tenderflocks, 2 Research Assistants, again more primal influence, helps with Felrauq. Also you can sacrifice it to skip ahead and play something big early. And Grenadine Drones, obviously amazing 1-drops on their own, and obviously synergize with Edge of Uprising. This deck was originally running more kill spells. I think it was running the Cremate, the Stone Scar killer unit, and give it Voidbound. But then I remembered Turn to Seed existed, and I thought this is a good opportunity to put that in, especially because I felt a little bit bad about running both Feeding Time and Cremate, both 4-cost kill spells. I felt like I needed a 3-1 in between the Annihilate and the Feeding Time, and well, this just fit that description. Looking back at the market, you can see Lightning Storm on here. It's a bit weird to be running Lightning Storm and not Hailstorm, because Hailstorm is just so much better. That 1 extra damage to each unit is usually a big deal, because 3 is kind of the threshold where most units that have 4 or more health and actually are a threat are usually pretty expensive. So it's much more likely that if you're dealing 3 damage to everything, you're going to get rid of everything that is a threat but not worth insta-killing. But with Lightning Storm, it leaves those 3 health units, which can be really awkward. But the reason why we're running it is because, 1, we have Blazing Salvo, so we want to be able to get 2-cost cards. But 2, with the Merchant in this deck, it's the Spell Damage Merchant, so it does become deal 3 damage to all units. So usually, this will actually be basically a Hailstorm, but for 2. And, of course, if you get it through Blazing Salvo, although it doesn't deal 2 damage to all, you did already deal 2 damage to a unit. So if one of their units had 3 health, then that one will still die. As well as that, we have Reread in here. This is just for a little bit of extra help with all the discards we're doing. You know, just extra card draw. Sometimes we might need, I think, all of a sudden, oh wait, I needed that spell. And also, it works really well with Savage Incursion, which is in this deck. Again, I thought, well, if we're going to go in the middle game plan, we need a reward for it, because I don't think this game is that we're very likely with this deck to actually go to full mill, like their entire deck's gone. So we need a card that actually benefits from this, and of course, we went for Savage Incursion, which makes sense. Although we can't pull it with Blazing Salvo, we do have 4 of these merchants, so there's a good chance we can get it from the market. We are running 4 Tome of Horrors with all these small units to get the discards going. Now, I feel like I'm just doing something out. No, I think that's actually everything, basically. So yeah, Reread is very good with Savage Incursion, because although usually 1 will do the job, it's also very feasible that you need to play 1 when you only have 10 cards in the opponent's void, just to stay alive and draw something to stall. But then if you do that, your 1 Savage Incursion is gone. What you're going to do? Oh, reread it and do it again. And usually by the time you reread it, they will be at 20 cards. Den of Ordeals is also just in here because, although this is a controlling kind of deck, we actually don't have much of a top end. We have Edge of Uprising, we have Foe Out the Outcast. Now that's not terrible, but obviously it's not that much for a top end. So this is kind of the, well, everything else failed, let's just go for the normal control game plan. This usually isn't a great sight, but I think with all the kill spells in this deck and all the board clears and the damage, obviously the Relic Weapon, the Edge of Uprising itself is pretty good at defending this site. I think this site will much more often complete its agenda in this deck. And of course, if this site completes its agenda, Nakova and Malot is a really, really good thing to get off of it. So yeah, that's that deck. I'm very interested to see if this one turns out to be good. I will admit, that's one I'm a little bit less sure that one will be good, but I'll put it like this. I do feel personally very much like it will be good, but yeah, from an objective perspective, it does seem a bit more memey. Now this one, I must admit, this probably is going to be the most flawed in the way it's made. But this is the Sentinel deck. So this is Stirring Sands. Where is it here? Which I also had to craft. The play Sentinel from your void. We have a decent amount of nice cheap explorers here. In combination with Nahid's Distillation as well, because we're running this Journey Guide Nahid's Distillation combo here. Because we have a decent amount of Explorers, we're also running Mysterium Orb, and of course we have Sentinels as well. Mysterium Orb has a nice little bit of synergy with Sandglass Juggernaut. It's not worth running 4 of these for it, but it's still quite nice. Sandglass Juggernaut is a 5/6/1 that's completely invincible to damage, but it's reckless, so you can't block with it. But if you give it Endurance, you can block with it, which means this is an impenetrable wall unless they just straight up kill this or silence it. Which, yeah, that's pretty good. As you can see, we've got our Giant Sentinels, we've got Clock Tower Sentinel and Great Kiln Titan. I should be running Heart of the Vault, but by the time I got round to that, of course, my shards were... my shift stone was all gone. I did own 4 Heart of the Vaults, but honestly, I was sick of it. Like, I really didn't like it being as strong as it was. I didn't have that much fun playing around with it. And as soon as it got nerfed, even though I knew it's probably still good, I thought, no, I'm just disenchanting all of them. In the end, I don't think that was too bad of me, because I did get a full Shiftstone refund, so technically I could go and dust some things and get them back, and I wouldn't have really lost out on anything. But yeah, I don't have any right now. It would take a while for me to get some, so they're not in the deck as of right now, but there's some easy cuts. I don't think we need both Groundbreaker and Storm Titan, so I'd probably cut a couple of those, and maybe I don't need Sandglass Juggernaut at all. Yeah, there's definitely cuttable things here. But yeah, this deck, as I was making it, I was thinking that actually, I was thinking 2 things. One is, actually 3. One is, we needed a decent amount of influence fixing, because of course there's a lot of heavy influence cards here. It's Praxis. So we got 3 Seek Powers and we got 2 Amber Acolytes. We've got Trailmakers. I feel like I'm missing one more thing. No, I guess that's it. Oh, and I suppose Learned Herbalist, kind of, with the secret pages. But speaking of Learned Herbalist, the second thing I realise is, there actually aren't that many ways to discard things in Praxis. Like, I feel really dumb, because, like, I knew that, but I thought, it's probably not that difficult. There's probably just some card I'm forgetting about that actually is pretty efficient at it. But no, there actually aren't that really many in Praxis that are very good at it. This is probably the best card for discarding things in your hand. You can also run the 2/1 Berserk that discards a card to create and draw Temper, but that obviously doesn't seem as synergistic with the game plan of this deck. The last thing I realised is, because of how difficult it is to discard these things, I realised, it might be a much better idea then to make this deck still kind of a Stirring Sands deck, but build it so that if you don't get Stirring Sand and you don't have Sentinels in your Void, it still works. So this does have still a bit of a normal curve, and as you can see, we still got Ramp and we still got Rambo for cost discounting, and obviously Journey Guide as well. And we generally, oh yeah, Sauropod Wrangler. I was running this because it's an Explorer, and of course it also helps with the whole, oh no, I can't cheat out my things early, let's just make them cheaper the normal way. So yeah, probably the one that's in the need of the most refinement. Oh yeah, and Pompous Historian. This might seem a bit kind of unintuitive. We want to discard the Sentinels, but this is a card that draws them and discards everything else. Well, the idea here is, if you do see 2 Sentinels on top of your deck or more than that, which I think should happen relatively often, then he can obviously, if you pick one, he'll discard the other. And as well as that, getting them into your hand isn't necessarily bad either, because that means that now Learned Herbalist can discard them. So yeah, I really think Clock Tower Sentinel has a decent chance in this deck, even though, again, I don't think it's super high tier. I don't think it's needed for this deck, but I do think it's a nice improvement to it. Which I think this is the last one, yeah. Authoritar. So this is my authoritarian creation control deck. Sorry, my throat feels weird. So anyway, so basically this deck is built around playing Authoritarian Creation, or less preferably, but if you couldn't get that, Soulburst Scimitar or Age-Worn Vestige, and basically just keeping it as long as you can. We're running 2 Tinker's Apprentice, yeah, that was what it was called, We're actually running 2 Heist as well. This is a little bit experimental. If this doesn't work out, we'll just run 4 of these. But I think this could be a good idea, because again, although adding in time helps a lot, I think this deck still will have a bit of a problem with draw. So I think that having this as a walk card is pretty nice, and I think this deck for the most part doesn't need the 1/1 that much. The only reason it really needs the 1/1 is for Touch of Resilience and Touch of Battle. I said those in the wrong order, but whatever. But aside from that, you really don't need the body on it, except for maybe to act as a chump blocker for a sight. Speaking of sights, we're running Larder again, of course, in this deck. We're running 2 Deezer's Office in the main deck, and then we're running both Regent's Tomb and Xenon Temple in the market, which is a little bit weird, but I think these are both amazing sites to put in the market, and so I do think it's worth it to take 2 market slots just to have the option to have both of these, because of course being able to pull a Xenon Initiation that will develop into even more terrifying things later from the market is very, very powerful at times. But then if you don't have much use for giving a unit killer, then Regent's Tomb is a much stronger option for it having a much more terrifying unit coming out of it. Also, of course, we've got Pit of Lunecta in here for the late game win condition, for if all else fails. Token of Vision for power and fixing. And the Nightmare Gates. The big, we're making our relic weapon giant now. And of course it works with the 1/1 to sacrifice it. To be fair, I might need a few more small bodies to sacrifice to it. Maybe you know what, I've caught myself out of running Heist. I wanted to try it, but considering I have to sacrifice something to the Nightmare Gates, I think that I do just run 14 because Apprentice. Because besides that, the only good targets is Ebon Dune Smuggler and a Pearl Abbey Smuggler that hasn't gotten any buffs. Which I think this will almost always get buffs, because there's a lot of spells in this deck. Touch of Resilience is just in here because it gives loads of value over time, and obviously this deck should be going for a long time. Touch of Battle's in here because giving this 1 attack relic weapon deadly makes it a lot better. Also you can give tiny units deadly, which makes them a lot scarier. Even the not so tiny unit like Larder, which is a relatively normal size unit, because it has low attack, having deadly makes it a lot better. We have that in combination with Slay and Casting Shadow. Sabertooth is of course a staple of time decks. It means we don't have to be as worried about relics, but also it gives us survivability and a solid stat line. Harsh Rule helps us control the board, but also clears the board so that we can hit face with our relic weapons. And of course Naheez's Distillation for draw. I think that just really leaves one thing to talk about, and that is Soulburst Scimitar. So I already mentioned this before, it's just one of the relic weapons in the deck, but why did I pick Soulburst Scimitar? It's a little bit weird because this is one of those cards where if you can actually get the mastery, it is really strong. But can you actually get the mastery? It seems like it wouldn't be that hard, but I don't think I've actually ever gotten the mastery off of this card. I haven't run it too often, to be fair, but I don't think I actually have ever gotten the mastery from this card. And I've never seen the enemy player can't spellcraft actually be relevant. If it was on a cursed relic, it'd probably be a bigger deal, but considering this is a relic weapon that can be broken very easily, usually within the space of a turn, that ability is not that relevant. So, yeah, this seems like a weird choice, but the reason it's here is because all of its problems seem to stem from the fact that it's both vulnerable, even though 4 health seems like a lot, for 5 it's not actually that big a deal. It's vulnerable, and on top of that it doesn't even get its mastery damage that fast. That's really the big issue with this weapon. But if you buff it up, that kind of solves both the issues, which is why we're running it in this deck, which buffs relic weapons. Of course, there's Tinker's Apprentice, there's the attack buff from Pillar of Progress. Oh yeah, I didn't talk about Pillar of Progress, but it's pretty obvious why it's here. It ramps you, it helps your authoritarian creation not be a joke when you play it at first. Same for Soulburst Scimitar and Aegon Vestige. Oh yeah, Erebos Designs. Okay, so I missed a couple things. Erebos Designs is mostly just here as a board clear, because, well, there's no other board clears that we can run in these colours that are actually any good. This just helps us live against aggro. And I think that combined with just the high health of a lot of these things, and good defensive power, and obviously efficient kills, means that we shouldn't die to aggro with this deck. So, yeah, is that everything? Yeah, that's everything. So, that's all the decks. Thanks for listening to me ramble on about these. hopefully some of these have inspired you yourselves to try some new cards. You might notice that I'm not running any Whispers of the Throne cards in here. I kind of misspoke in my last video. I haven't bought Whispers of the Throne yet. I was about to buy it, and then this came out, and it's like, oh, great. So I'm falling behind. I have tried the Whispers of the Throne cards out, because I'm helping a friend out on their account, and so I bought it on their account, and so I've played the cards there on their account. Yeah, I haven't been able to get enough gold together to get it myself, so there's no Whispers of the Throne cards in here. I didn't think of any strategies in particular that would be way better with the Whispers of the Throne cards anyway, except maybe Vox. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Oh yeah, Nightmare Valkyries. Nightmare Valkyries with Vox is something that could be serious, but I don't think there's any other things from Whispers in the Throne in particular that makes me think, oh yeah, I wish I had that with these cards. There might be something with Practice Trove, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. You're going to have to bear with me while I get to OBS to quit and stop the recording. Click off the video. You don't have to watch me embarrass myself like this. There we go.